The most disturbing observation to emerge from in-depth investigation into patterns of human illness that defy purely medical explanations comes not from epidemiological statistics or laboratory discoveries, but from growing recognition among therapists, holistic doctors, and even some conventional practitioners willing to look beyond materialistic paradigms that a substantial proportion of chronic illnesses, especially those that appear without obvious genetic or environmental causes, and that stubbornly resist conventional treatments, seem to emerge precisely at moments in life when a person is living in profound disconnection from authentic soul purposes. Ignoring inner calls for fundamental changes in life direction that became impossible to continue avoiding through distractions and rationalizations that had worked for years, keeping person on trajectories that were safe and socially acceptable, but that were progressively more stifling to the true self that needed to express itself in ways that artificially constructed personality through conformity to external expectations did not allow. This pattern, where dramatic physical symptoms finally forcing attention and change appear only after gentler subtle signs have been systematically ignored through years of denying psychological discomforts, suppressing disturbing intuitions about the need for radical transformations, and rationalizing persistent feelings of emptiness or restlessness as being just temporary phases that would pass if one would just work harder or keep busier by avoiding confrontation with inner truths that were uncomfortable to acknowledge because they threatened structures of identity in life that had been laboriously constructed over decades of effort and investment, suggest that the body is not merely a biological machine operating according to purely mechanical laws, independent of psychological and spiritual states, but is an intelligent instrument through which deeper dimensions of being communicate when normal channels of communication through thoughts, feelings, and intuitions are systematically blocked by ego that refuses to listen to messages that contradict established narratives about who a person is and what life should be. When soul, using this term not in a dogmatic religious sense, but as a reference to the authentic core of individuality that exists beneath layers of social conditioning and personality construction, has an impulse or direction that needs to be manifested in life but is being consistently blocked by conscious choices of ego that prefers the security of the known. Even when known has become a suffocating prison, communication does not stop simply because it is ignored, but progressively intensifies through channels increasingly impossible to ignore until it finally manifests as a physical symptom that forces the person to stop completely on the path they were on, following and confronting fundamental questions about the meaning and direction of life that he had been avoiding by keeping himself constantly occupied with superficial urgencies that consumed all available attention, leaving no room for deep reflection on whether the life that was being lived was the life that the soul really wanted to live, or was merely the performance of a socially prescribed script that was never adequately questioned. The understanding that the body functions as a messenger of the soul communicating through symptoms when other channels are blocked is not a new invention of the contemporary New Age movement, but has deep roots in ancient healing traditions that have always recognized intimate connections between soul states and bodily manifestations, and which were only temporarily obscured by the rise of a mechanistic medical paradigm in recent centuries that treated the body as a faulty machine to be repaired through technical interventions without the need to consider psychological or spiritual dimensions of the person experiencing illness. Hippocrates already observed that it was more important to know what kind of person had an illness than what kind of illness a person had, recognizing that even physically identical conditions manifested themselves differently and responded to treatments differently depending on the unique psychological constitutions of individuals. Shamanic traditions of different cultures always worked on the premise that illnesses were often manifestations of spiritual imbalances or the loss of parts of the soul that had to be recovered through shamanic journeys before physical healing could fully occur. Traditional Chinese medicine developed an elaborate system of correspondences between physical organs and specific emotional states, recognizing that liver stored unprocessed anger, lungs stored uncried sadness, kidneys stored fears deep, and that effective treatment should address both emotional and physical dimensions of imbalances, and even Freud and psychoanalysts who followed recognized through studies of hysteria that dramatic physical symptoms could emerge as symbolic expressions of psychological conflicts that could not be processed consciously, and that therefore found expression through the body, creating paralysis, blindness, pain without detectable organic causes that miraculously disappeared when underlying conflicts were brought to consciousness and worked on therapeutically. What is relatively new in contemporary understanding is recognition not only that emotional states influence physical health, which is already widely accepted through research on stress and the immune system, but that there is a deeper dimension of communication where the soul or authentic self that transcends conscious personality deliberately uses the body as a means of forcing confrontation with truths that are being systematically avoided because they threaten life structures that have been built, but that no longer serve authentic developmental purposes, and that therefore must be transformed even when transformation is frightening, because it requires abandoning known securities and venturing into territories, unknowns where there are no guarantees of success, but where there is at least the possibility of living authentically, instead of merely existing in suffocating conformity to other people's expectations. The mechanism through which the soul communicates through the body when other channels are blocked operates through multiple pathways that research in psychoneuroimmunology and psychosomatic medicine has begun to map, although it is still far from fully understanding the complexity of interactions between mind, emotions, spirit, and physiological processes. The first well-documented mechanism is through the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis that translates psychological states of chronic stress into hormonal cascades that suppress immune function, elevate systemic inflammation, disrupt glucose regulation and metabolism, increase blood pressure and heart rate, and through years of chronic activation without adequate periods of recovery, create fertile ground for the development of conditions ranging from autoimmune diseases, where a dysregulated immune system attacks self-tissues, to cancers, where compromised immune surveillance allows abnormal cells to proliferate without adequate control. Second mechanism operates through chronic muscular tensions that are somatic responses to sustained emotional states. Suppressed anger creates tensions in the jaw, shoulders, and neck. Unprocessed fear creates contractions in the abdomen and pelvis. Unexpressed sadness creates chest tightness and shallow breathing. And when these tensions are maintained chronically through years of not allowing expression and processing of underlying emotions, they create distorted postural patterns that compromise circulation, compress nerves, limit breathing, and eventually manifest as pain, chronic problems, back problems, respiratory dysfunctions that have real structural components but that originate from psychological patterns of emotional containment. Third mechanism operates through the autonomic nervous system that regulates involuntary organ functions, in which, when chronically unbalanced, due to persistent psychological stress with dominance of the sympathetic fight or flight system without adequate activation of the parasympathetic rest and digestion system, creates disturbances in digestion manifesting as irritable bowel syndrome or inflammatory bowel disease, in cardiovascular function manifesting as hypertension or arrhythmias, in reproductive function manifesting as menstrual irregularities or dysfunctions, sexual, endocrine function manifesting as thyroid problems or various hormonal imbalances. In addition to these relatively well-understood physiological mechanisms, there is a more subtle and controversial dimension of how specific symptoms that emerge seem to have a symbolic or metaphorical quality, relating directly to the nature of psychological or spiritual conflicts that are being avoided. A person who feels burdened with responsibilities that they did not want to take on but accepted because they are unable to say no develops back problems, especially the lower back, which literally cannot bear to carry any more weight. A person who is in a relationship or job who feels toxic but cannot leave it out of fear or guilt develops digestive problems or hepatic disorders, as if the body is trying to process and eliminate toxins that the person cannot eliminate from their lives through conscious choices. A person who has important things to express, but who constantly censors themselves to maintain peace or approval, develops throat or thyroid problems, as if the ability to speak and express is diminishing, physically blocked. These symbolic correspondences between symptoms and psychological conflicts are not accepted by conventional medicine because they are difficult to prove through double-blind controlled studies that are the gold standard of scientific evidence. But they are consistently observed by therapists who have worked deeply with people over years, following not just isolated symptoms, but entire narratives of lives where patterns reveal themselves when the whole story is considered, rather than just fragmented snapshots of clinical presentations in brief consultations focused exclusively on physical complaints, disconnected from biographical and existential contexts where emerge. The crucial question is not whether these symbolic correspondences are always literally true in all cases, because obviously there are many other causes of diseases, including genetic factors, environmental exposures, infections, accidents that have nothing to do with states of mind. But it is to recognize that in a substantial number of cases, especially those that appear without obvious causes and that resist conventional treatments, there is a psychological and spiritual dimension that, when ignored, results in incomplete treatment that can temporarily suppress symptoms through medications, but that does not resolve deep causes that will continue to generate manifestations, perhaps in different forms, when original blockage is not adequately addressed through real changes in life, and in relationship with the authentic self that is trying to express itself but is being systematically silenced. The characteristic temporal pattern of how illnesses manifest when the soul is being ignored typically follows a predictable progression beginning with subtle psychological and emotional signs that, if unheeded, escalate to minor psychosomatic symptoms that, if continued to be ignored, eventually manifest as serious physical conditions that finally force confrontation with issues that have been avoided. The first stage usually involves vague but persistent feelings of dissatisfaction, restlessness, deep boredom that is not relieved by entertainment, a feeling of living someone else's life or of playing a role in a script that one did not write, recurring dreams with themes of being trapped or missing important opportunities, frequent fantasies about alternative lives that could have been lived if different choices had been made at crucial decision points, and generally these psychological signs are rationalized as being normal discontents that everyone has, or as temporary phases that will pass when external circumstances change or when the next goal is achieved, finally bringing satisfaction that always seems to be just beyond the current horizon. Second stage, when psychological signs are not heeded, involves emergence of minor but persistent physical symptoms, such as tension headaches, intermittent digestive problems, sleep disturbances, fatigue that does not improve with rest, changes in appetite or weight, minor recurring illnesses such as frequent colds or infections that suggest that the immune system is compromised. And generally, these symptoms are treated symptomatically through analgesics, antacids, supplements, attempts to improve sleep hygiene without investigating deeper causes of why the body is manifesting these signs of imbalance at this particular time in life. Third stage, when psychological signs and minor symptoms continue to be ignored, involves development of a serious medical condition that can no longer be ignored or treated casually, but that requires significant medical attention, and that often forces the person to stop completely or drastically reduce activities that they have been performing automatically without question. Heart attack, cancer diagnosis, severe autoimmune disease, nervous breakdown, serious accident, and it is often only at the stage when faced with mortality or significant disability that the person finally stops long enough to deeply question how they were living and what really matters, by allowing the questions that the soul has been trying to communicate through more subtle channels finally receive attention that they deserve to have received much earlier, when changes could still be made in less dramatic and traumatic ways. Specific categories of soul callings that are most often ignored, leading to somatic manifestations when blockage is maintained for a prolonged time, include first call to authenticity, where a person is living in ways that contradict deeply held values or that require constant suppression of important aspects of identity to maintain social approval or economic security. Gay person who remains in heterosexual marriage for decades out of fear of family rejection. Active person who works in a stifling corporate job because she was taught that art is not a viable career. An introvert who constantly forces herself into extroverted social contexts because she believes there is something wrong with preferring solitude. A person who has deep spiritual or political convictions, but who hides them completely in an environment that is hostile so as not to create conflict. A second often ignored call is to establish or restore healthy boundaries, where the person is allowing consistent violations of personal boundaries through failing to say no to the demands of others, even when those demands are excessive or inappropriate, accepting abusive or disrespectful treatment in relationships because they believe they do not deserve better or out of fear of being alone, consistently sacrificing their own needs to meet the needs of others because they have been taught that self-care is selfish, maintaining toxic relationships out of a sense of obligation or guilt, even when relationships are clearly causing more harm than good. Third calling is to express creativity or unique gifts that are being systematically suppressed because person has internalized messages that particular talents they possess are worthless or not practical enough to be taken seriously, spending all energy on activities that are merely means of survival, without investing anything in activities that bring genuine joy and sense of meaning, living in ways that are completely functional and responsible, but that are emotionally dead because there is no room for expression of dimensions of self that do not serve utilitarian purposes, but are essential to feeling alive and connected to inner source of vitality. A fourth, often ignored call is to heal emotional wounds from the past that are being kept buried through mechanisms of denial and distraction, but that continue to influence the present through repetitive patterns of destructive relationships, disproportionate emotional reactions to triggers that activate unprocessed trauma, or through systematic avoidance of situations that could be enriching but are avoided because they activate anxieties rooted in previous traumatic experiences that were never adequately processed and integrated, allowing the person to move beyond them instead of continuing to be defined and limited by them. The reason why these soul calls, when ignored, eventually manifest as physical illnesses is related to the fact that living in fundamental disconnection from authentic purposes and deep needs of self is not merely a matter of being psychologically uncomfortable, but creates a state of existential stress that is as or more detrimental to physical health as more obviously physical stresses of poor nutrition or exposure to toxins. Because a human being is not merely a physical body that can function adequately, as long as basic material needs are satisfied, but is an integrated being where physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual dimensions are all interconnected, and where health in any dimension depends on balance and harmony in all others. When a person chronically lives in betrayal of their authentic self, forcing themselves daily to be who they are not, to do what they do not want, to suppress what they really feel, to deny what they really need, this creates a state of inner dissonance that is deeply stressful at levels that transcend ordinary psychological stress, because it violates the fundamental integrity of being by touching existential dimensions of who the person is in essence, not just how they are functioning at a particular moment. This existential stress of living in bad faith with oneself, as Sartre would describe, or of being alienated from one's essence as diverse spiritual traditions, recognize cannot be compensated by external successes, nor by temporary distractions, because the problem is not in circumstances, but in fundamental relationship with self that is fragmented rather than integrated, divided rather than wholeness, performative rather than authentic. And while this inner division is maintained through continuing to ignore calls to live in ways that would be more aligned with inner truth, even when these ways are frightening or inconvenient, body inevitably. It will suffer consequences because it cannot operate optimally when it is serving as a vehicle for life that contradicts purposes for which it was designed, which are not merely biological survival, but manifestation of unique soul potentials that it has chosen to incarnate precisely to express qualities and perform tasks that only this particular individuality can accomplish in ways that no other can exactly duplicate. The appropriate response when illness emerges that appears to be related to ignoring soul calls is not merely to treat symptoms through conventional medical interventions. Although these are often necessary and important to stabilize the condition and alleviate immediate suffering, it is about using the crisis that illness represents as an opportunity to finally stop and listen to what the soul has been trying to communicate through channels that are progressively more impossible to ignore, recognizing that physical symptoms are messengers, bringing vital information about imbalances that need to be addressed not only in the body, but in life as a whole. A crucial first step is to create space for deep reflection on life that was being lived before illness emerged by asking honestly not just what caused this illness in medical terms, but what in my life was so out of alignment that my body had to scream this way to draw my attention to the need for fundamental changes that I had been avoiding. Which aspects of life were draining vitality without returning corresponding meaning? Which relationships were being maintained out of obligation or fear rather than genuine love and free choice? Which activities consumed time and energy without bringing joy or a sense of purpose? Which authentic parts of self were being systematically suppressed to maintain peace or approval or security, which turned out to be false security because it was built on a foundation of betrayal of the self that would eventually collapse anyway. Second step is to allow yourself to feel completely, without blame or judgment, all the emotions that emerge when these issues are honestly confronted. Anger at having wasted years or decades living in ways that were inauthentic, sadness at missed opportunities and parts of self that have been neglected or abandoned, fear about what necessary changes would entail in terms of having to leave known securities and take risks in the unknown, guilt about how changes would affect others who depend on the person continuing to play established roles. And through allowing full expression of these emotions in safe contexts, whether through writing, therapy, conversations with trusted people, or body practices that release stored emotional tensions, begin to process and integrate emotional material that had been kept suppressed, contributing to imbalances that manifested as illness. Third step is to begin making concrete changes, however small initially, toward greater alignment between outer life and inner truth, starting with areas where change is most possible, even if not yet the most significant. Establishing healthier boundaries in relationships where violations were tolerated, devoting regular, even minimal time to activities that bring genuine joy and a sense of connection to authentic self, honestly expressing, at least in some safe contexts, thoughts and feelings that were previously always censored, making choices even in small matters based on what you really want rather than what you think you should want, and what others expect. Fourth step, when conditions stabilizes sufficiently, is to seriously consider larger changes that may be necessary to live in ways that are sustainable in the long term, rather than merely making superficial adjustments that relieve pressure temporarily, but that leave fundamental life structures that are problematically intact. This may involve career changes, even when they are financially risky, relationship endings even when they are emotionally painful, location changes even when they are logistically complicated, or identity transformations even when they are socially challenging, recognizing that although these changes are scary and difficult, there is a cost of not doing them when they are genuinely necessary to live authentically is much greater in terms of vitality, health, and quality of life than the cost of doing them even when they imply significant sacrifices of external security. Fifth step is to develop regular practices that maintain conscious connection with authentic self and soul purpose, rather than allowing life to automatically return to old patterns of disconnection when immediate crisis passes and ordinary life pressures resume. This may include regular meditation or contemplation, creating space to listen to inner voice without interference from constant external noise, journal writing, exploring honest thoughts and feelings without censorship, ongoing therapy, or coaching providing support to maintain change and work through resistances and fears that inevitably emerge, body practices such as yoga or dance that maintain awareness of bodily signals, indicating when a person is returning to patterns of tension and disconnection, or participation. In communities that value authenticity and personal growth by providing mirrors that reflect when a person is living there authentically versus when returning to old standards of performance and compliance. The profound message that body communicates through falling ill when soul is ignored is not punishment, nor is it evidence of failure, but is act of self-love on a level deeper than conscious ego, where authentic self that cares for wholeness and integrity of being as totality intervenes. When ego that is only small, conscious part of total self is making choices that are destructive to well-being of totality, even when these choices seem logical or necessary from limited perspective of ego concerned. Only with survival and approval in conventional terms. Body getting sick is essentially saying, you can't continue this way because you are violating something fundamental about who you are, and if you don't stop voluntarily and change direction, I will force you to stop by taking away the ability to continue functioning on autopilot without deeply questioning what you are doing and why. It is forced interruption of unsustainable trajectory, not because something is wrong with the person, but precisely because something is deeply right at levels that transcend conscious ego, where deeper wisdom of authentic self recognizes that current life is not life that soul came to live and therefore must. Being transformed, even when transformation is frightening and painful, because the alternative of continuing to live in betrayal of the self is far worse in terms of the cost to the integrity and vitality of being as a whole, operating across multiple dimensions that must all be in harmony if genuine health is to be possible rather than just temporary. Absence of symptoms that will inevitably return in possibly more severe forms if root causes are not addressed through real changes in how life is being lived. The wisdom of recognizing the body as a warning rather than as a problem to be eliminated completely transforms the relationship with illness from something to be combated by suppressing symptoms as quickly as possible to return to normal functioning, to something to be listened to with attention and gratitude, even in the midst of the suffering it causes, because it is bringing vital information that can save life, not just in the sense of preventing physical death, but in the deeper sense of preventing spiritual death of living an entire life without ever realizing authentic potentials or expressing unique gifts, because one was too busy conforming to expectations and maintaining superficial securities to risking the vulnerability of living authentically. When a person learns to listen to bodily signals not just when they become glaring through serious illness, but at much earlier stages when they are just whispers of discomfort or vague intuitions that something is not right, even when they cannot articulate exactly what, they can make course adjustments much sooner, avoiding the need for dramatic soul interventions through health crises that force changes that could have been made voluntarily if the person was sufficiently attuned to inner guidance to recognize when they were straying from the authentic path before the deviation became so severe that dramatic correction was necessary. This ability to tune in to subtle signals requires developing body awareness through practices that cultivate presence and attention to physical sensations, emotions, and intuitions, rather than living primarily in the head, disconnected from the rest of being, requires courage to honor what the body and emotions are communicating even when messages contradict rational plans or social expectations, and requires trust that the inner wisdom of the authentic self that expresses itself through these channels is a more reliable guide to important life decisions than ego logic or the opinions of others who do not have access to intimate knowledge of purpose, unique and deep needs of individual soul. The final invitation that understanding body as messenger of soul offers is not to live in constant fear of becoming ill if we do not perfectly follow all inner impulses, because this would just be a new form of tyranny, replacing conformity to external expectations with anxious conformity to every fluctuation of internal states, but is to develop respectful dialogue, relationship with authentic self, recognizing that there is wisdom operating at levels deeper than conscious ego that deserves to be consulted and taken into serious consideration when important decisions are being made, that signs of psychological or physical discomfort are not necessarily problems to be eliminated through suppression. Symptoms, but are often valuable information about imbalances that need to be addressed through real changes in life, and that the ultimate goal is not to reach a state of perfection without tensions or challenges, because growth always involves discomfort of extending beyond established comfort zones, but is achieving a state of integrity where external life is sufficiently aligned with inner truth that a person can live with a sense of authenticity and purpose even when facing inevitable difficulties of human existence, because difficulties are being faced in service of genuine values and expression of true self, rather than being suffered in service of conformity to expectations that have never been adequately questioned nor consciously chosen as authentic expressions of who a person truly is and what they truly value when all layers of conditioning are removed, revealing the essential core of unique individuality that came into existence to fulfill possibilities that only this specific person can manifest in ways that no other will ever duplicate, precisely because each soul is irreducible and irreplaceable, contributing unique perspective to the totality of collective human experience that would be impoverished if any authentic voice were silenced through forced conformity to standards that serve social structures, but that betray individual souls' needs to fully express themselves in all their diversity and particularity. The body warns not to punish nor to limit, but to protect integrity of being as a totality that cannot function optimally when it is being used for purposes that contradict essential reasons. Why soul chose to incarnate accepting all limitations and vulnerabilities of physical existence precisely because it saw opportunities for development and expression that only through material form could be realized, but that require life to be lived in ways that honor authentic purposes rather than betraying them through choices that are safe but that are spiritually dead because there is no connection to source. Inner sense of meaning and vitality that is the only true source of integral health, transcending mere absence of symptoms to encompass wholeness of being, where all physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual dimensions are harmoniously integrated, allowing life to be lived fully rather than merely survived through the performance of roles that have been externally prescribed without ever being critically examined nor consciously chosen as authentic expressions of the unique individuality that each person is, in essence, beneath all layers of conditioning and personality construction that are useful for navigating the social world, but should not be confused with totality of who a person truly is when viewed from the perspective of a soul that transcends temporary identities and that persists through all the changes and transformations that life brings as a constant observer, witnessing experiences, but not being reduced to any particular experience, because essential identity is rooted in dimensions that transcend changing circumstances of material existence, even while manifesting through these circumstances as a means of development and expression, which is the fundamental purpose of incarnating, choosing to accept all limitations of physical form, because through these limitations, paradoxically, unique possibilities for growth become available that would not exist in dimensions where everything is fluid and malleable, without resistances that force development of capabilities that only through encountering obstacles can be cultivated, transforming latent potentials into manifest capabilities through forced exercise. That discomfort of limitations and challenges provides making incarnation, neither prison nor punishment, but school of development where every experience, including and especially experiences of illness, when they are properly understood as soul messages rather than merely as medical problems to be resolved, technically contributes to progressive education of consciousness, developing wisdom, compassion, and capabilities that serve evolution not only of the individual but of the collective, through waves of influence that each genuine transformation of individual person creates, affecting everyone with whom they interact directly or indirectly, because at deep levels everyone is interconnected, and development of each contributes to the elevation of all through mechanisms that transcend ordinary physical causality, operating in dimensions of meaning and consciousness that are as real as material dimensions, even when they are not measurable through physical instruments that detect only denser frequencies of reality, leaving invisible, subtler dimensions where deep causes of physical phenomena originate, and where more significant transformations happen when a person has the courage to work on causal levels instead of merely treating superficial symptoms that will continue to be generated until the roots are addressed through genuine changes in consciousness and choices of how living that emerge when transformed. Consciousness recognizes that old life no longer serves authentic purposes, and that new life Although frightening in the unknown it represents is the only possibility of integrity and wholeness that allows for true health rather than just management of symptoms of life, lived in fundamental misalignment with soul purposes that does not give up communicating through all available channels, including last resort of body becoming. Ill when all other warnings were systematically ignored by ego that preferred security of known, even when known was prison, suffocating vitality and meaning that are hallmarks of life, lived authentically in alignment with inner truth.